Okay, well, what I'll do is I will get going now. I'll just do a bit of an introduction anyway, so it'll give other people a chance to pop in if they're going to. Otherwise, this is also going to be recorded. So if you are obviously joining me now, but you can't join for the whole hour, then do remember that you can kind of go back to the website and just kind of re-watch that or watch the end of it if you don't manage to watch to the end today. As I've already mentioned, do kind of note down any questions. You can put it in the chat if you want, or you can ask at the end. That's absolutely fine. I give people the opportunity to come on and kind of ask questions if you're happy to do that with everybody else, and I'll happily answer those there. Or as I say, you can kind of email me afterwards if you prefer. That's absolutely fine. Okay, so we're going to crack on. We are going to be talking today all about improving our energy levels through both healthy food, and we'll talk a little bit about other lifestyle choices as well, which kind of all come as part and parcel of healthy lifestyles and trying to improve our energy levels in particular, which is obviously what our focus is going to be. Generally, there'll be lots of things linked to healthy eating and healthy lifestyles, which are just good tips going forwards in general. But obviously, I will try and relate that a lot to how that's going to improve your energy as we go along, and you may have particular questions which are related to, you know, your specific lifestyle, something that you're eating that you're interested in knowing more about, or maybe it's to do with kind of your job. We're all kind of very busy people, and energy is very important to us, so it's important to kind of get as much information as possible. But it's just remembering that obviously you are a unique individual, and everybody does have different lifestyles, different jobs, different levels of kind of stress and relaxation and all of those things as well. So it's important to remember that there will be kind of differences based on the types of things that we'll be talking about today. Okay, so just as a quick overview, first of all, we're going to be talking about kind of the do's and the don'ts really of eating for energy. So some of the kind of top tips which will help you get in the right mindset for thinking about your energy levels really. And then we'll be looking at choosing the right types of food. So what types of foods are the kind of thing which are going to help improve your energy levels. So we'll look at some specifics and then some kind of general kind of food groups and things like that. We'll look specifically at how glucose impacts energy levels, okay, so where that comes from, what it is, and how we can kind of reduce things like glucose spikes, which there is nothing actually wrong with those, but it's looking at the impact of how regularly that occurs, what type of spike it is, and things like that. Then we'll also, as I mentioned, look at the impact of other lifestyle choices on our energy levels. So it's not just totally food, but it's how other things might interact with what you're eating, and which might make a difference to how much energy you feel you have. And as I say, I'll try and leave a little bit of time for Q&A at the end if anyone's got any questions they'd like to ask. Okay, so first of all, those of you who haven't been on one of my sessions before, my name is Caroline Collard. I am a registered nutritionist. I do a lot of work within sports nutrition as a particular interest of mine, but I also work obviously with general healthy lifestyles, weight loss in particular, people suffering with chronic diseases, how to improve their health through nutrition. I'm also a qualified personal trainer. Again, I kind of work a lot within the sporting world, so I do a lot of strength and conditioning, not only with athletes but in people who just want to get stronger and fitter, and I do quite a lot of injury rehabilitation work on that side of things, and as part of the injury rehab I do sports massage therapy and the odd bit of relaxation as well for those people who so wish. I do a lot of one-to-one consultations. I work in Histon and Impington for my business, which is called PRO.FORMANCE, and I'm based right by Histon Football Club on Bridge Road. I also do small group things, obviously lots of presentations like today, lots of work with businesses. I do workshops and courses for people, and plenty of webinars, as I said. My contact details are there, but I'll put them on the end screen as well. So as I say, if you do want to get in contact afterwards or have a look at the website or anything along those lines, you'll be able to get those contact details again at the end. Okay, so Before I really go into the topic, I always love starting a lot of these nutrition sessions, particularly the ones relating to health in general, with thinking about your reasons why you might want to perhaps make some changes when it comes to your food choices, and learn a bit more about nutrition, how it's kind of linked to how you feel. Obviously today's focus being kind of improving energy levels, but how it can also affect your moods in general, particularly women who I work a lot with, and how it might help them with the menopause, and also just lots of people that I work with that have a lot of chronic illness. As you can see, there's a kind of a long list there of both very common ones, which we see more and more, but also some which you perhaps wouldn't necessarily have associated with better nutrition, such as fertility issues and brain diseases, immune systems, things like that, emotional stress as well, and how that impacts, how we're feeling. I put on that list always save the NHS, because a lot of these things they're quite preventable through lifestyle choices. So the more we learn about what we're putting in our bodies, about nutrition, about improving our health, the less pressure over time we're going to be putting on our NHS. So that's another great reason to have kind of in the back of your mind, in terms of a reason why you might want to make some healthier changes through nutrition. So one of my first top tips, we're going through the do's and the don'ts of kind of improving energy. My first one always, and I always link this both to energy levels, but also to those people, particularly at this time of year, who like to focus a bit more on kind of not just healthy eating, but maybe weight loss as well. But my biggest thing is don't ever go hungry. We should never have the need to feel kind of, certainly not extreme hunger. And I'm not saying feeling a little bit hungry actually isn't, it does do us some good sometimes. We kind of learn about our real hunger cues, for example, rather than just, I feel like I need a nibble on something. It's really thinking about, am I actually hungry? What are my hunger cues? Is my stomach properly rumbling? And actually, if I was given something which I wouldn't perhaps normally choose, a very healthy option, would I want to eat it at this point in time? It might be a plate of, you might think of a plate of vegetables, or just some what lots of people might consider to be the boring fruits, like if I was to give an apple, would I want this apple? Am I hungry enough to think, oh yeah, that's going to satisfy my need? So that is thinking about hunger in that sense, really. But you shouldn't really have to go hungry. Ideally, you want to be able to eat every 4 to 5 hours, which for some people actually seems like quite a long stretch. Lots of people will think about having breakfast, lunch and dinner, but then snacking in between. But a lot of the time, as long as you eat really well at each meal time, there's not necessarily a need to snack. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with having a snack. It's what you're choosing to have for that snack. If you're going to have something to, not just, as I say, kind of fill time, or because you feel a bit bored, or you're procrastinating, or anything along those lines, but you're actually got hunger cues and you think, actually, I could just do with something small just to kind of keep me going until I get to lunchtime. Or if you've got a bigger gap because of work or whatever reasons, or you've got a meeting and it's going to last extra long period of time and you do need something just to keep you going, then it's choosing the right kinds of things. Now, I'm not going to say too much about choosing the right kinds of foods just yet, because I am going to be coming back to that in the presentation and going into that in a bit more detail. So, as I say, ideally it would be to eat as regularly, at least every 4 to 5 hours, to make sure that we've got plenty of food going in at each of those meals, and we've got enough to keep us going, which is why I say don't go hungry. You should never have to feel that the food you're eating is not enough at that mealtime. You should really leave a meal feeling very satiated, so feeling like you've had enough to eat, you feel satisfied that you've had enough, and that all your hunger cues have kind of been fulfilled, and that actually it is hopefully going to be enough to get you through to that next meal time. And again, I'm going to go into more detail about how to think about making sure that you can do that and have a really big meal at every of those 3 main meal times. but not kind of over energizing, not having really high energy dense meals, but actually being able to keep them low energy density in terms of the amount of calories that perhaps we're taking on board, but making sure that that meal is still plenty big enough for you to feel like you've had a really good meal. So we will come back to that in more detail. The other thing to say is get organised. Again, we're going to talk about this in a bit more detail in a moment, and that would include things like planning a little bit, making sure that you know roughly, doesn't have to be perfect, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a moment in terms of meal planning, but roughly knowing what you're going to be kind of eating, being a bit boring in some ways. You know, you might have the same kind of breakfast every day, a very similar lunch or similar dinner, but you're just varying it up in small ways so that it feels like you're eating different meals every day, but actually you roughly know what kind of things are going to be going into every meal. And the more that you can kind of be organized and know what you're going to be eating, and you've got all the things in the fridge or the freezer that you're going to need, you're not going to do what most people will do, which is when it comes to a really busy or unexpectedly busy day that you haven't perhaps planned for something, you know, as I say, unexpected to happen that puts you off your normal routine, therefore leaves you with less time to kind of prepare a dinner, a healthy dinner. Actually, you've got everything you need, or you've pre-prepped some of that meal already, so it really isn't an inconvenience to actually get it prepared quite quickly. So that leads me on to food prepping. Now, I'm not going to spend loads of time talking about food prepping as part of this organisation, because I'm actually going to be doing a whole session on Wednesday as well, all to do with food preparation, budgeting, batch cooking and things like that. So I'm going to cover all of this in much more detail during that session on Wednesday. That's Wednesday lunchtime at 12 p.m. and it will also be recorded if you can't make it to that session. So feel free to obviously have a look on the website once that has been recorded and you can get a lot more detail. But I'm going to do just a little bit now for those of you who can't make it. So what is food prepping? Food prepping can be done in a real variety of ways. You know, it's what I call a ladder of food prepping. It can be very, very basic, or it can be very, very detailed, depending on what kind of a person you are and how organised you like to be and how much you feel it's helping you to stay on track with healthy eating. Or you can also do something very, as I say, kind of basic, where you've just prepped a few simple things which are really just going to help you out throughout your busy week, to help you stay on track and to have those foods that we're going to be going on to talk about, which are going to be giving you the best level of energy for what you need for whatever, you know, the type of lifestyle that you lead. So the first thing is thinking about food prepping as prepping any sort of food that you know you're going to have, whether it's a whole meal, whether it's just you cook a few ingredients that are going to go into a meal, which perhaps take a bit longer normally on a weekday, ahead of time before you plan to eat it. Okay, now that can be something that you then just put in the fridge and it's there ready to pop into a meal at the last minute, or it could be something where you kind of batch cook and prep a particular ingredient, you cook a load of it up and then you freeze lots of it, so that again you can, just like any sort of freezer meal, you can kind of get it out, but actually it's come from fresh prepared food. Preparing obviously a mixture of raw and cooked foods as individual ingredients can be a really good way for some people if they don't have the time to cook full and prepare full whole meals. So for example, you may think, right, well, we're going to be having kind of jacket potatoes with other things at some point this week. I've planned that maybe for Tuesday or Wednesday this week. But, you know, the jacket potatoes might take a whole hour in the oven. What happens if I get home late? If I'm not going to have time to actually do that full jacket potato, I might end up doing some sort of convenience food of some kind instead. Actually, you know, things like that, if you do a little bit of prep on a weekend or whenever you have a spare hour to prep a few separate ingredients, you could just pop a load of potatoes into the oven, cook them there, and then let them cool and put them into the fridge and not use them on that day, or even the next day. It might be 2 days later. As long as you've kind of cooled it down relatively quickly, popped it into the fridge, kept it in a container of some kind with a lid, that food is going to be absolutely fine a couple of days later. So on the day, you could just get out your potatoes, thing that takes the most amount of time. Maybe you have even a tin of beans to add to that, a tin of tuna, maybe veg as well. And again, if you were strapped for time, you could easily just get a bag of frozen veg out of the freezer. Remember, frozen veg is absolutely fine, still very nutritious to use, not a problem there if you don't have time to cook fresh. Pop that all into the microwave together, and you've got your meal in a very short period of time. Same applies to maybe cooking some other harder veg, for example. So it could be things like butternut squash, other potatoes like sweet potato, for example, things that just take that much more time than just, okay, well, I can just get the bag of peas out of the freezer and put it in the microwave for 5 minutes and Bob's your uncle. Actually, the ones where we perhaps want to get a bit more dark green veg, it could be your broccolis, even harder cabbages or Brussels sprouts even, that kind of thing. You can pre-cook those, pop them into a container in your fridge, and then literally just get them out as and when you need it. Not everything has to be cooked fresh at that moment in time. So as I said, food prepping can be in a variety of different ways, whatever suits some people. But if you're not entirely sure also exactly what you want to eat for the week, let's say you haven't done a whole kind of full meal plan, thinking Monday we're going to have this, Tuesday we're going to have this, but actually think, well, we always have jacket potatoes at some point, we always have that kind of a meal at some point, and that kind of a meal on another day. I'll just prep some of those ingredients, those ones which take a little bit longer, ahead of time, keep them in the fridge, and then when it comes to on the day, it's really not going to take me much time to put that normal meal together. Batch cooking is a slightly more organized form of kind of food prepping. It really does involve you deciding, actually, we do have these very kind of samey meals or similar things each week, or I can plan, let's say, 5 to 7 main meals, which will probably be evening meals for most people. You decide on those 7 main meals, you make sure you go and do the shopping for all of those main meals, you've got all the ingredients in, and you set aside a couple of hours at one particular time where you actually just say, right, I'm going to make that meal, that meal, that meal, and then you buy big containers and you can freeze lots of them. You can kind of batch cook for 2 weeks worth, because actually you can really kind of batch cook lots. It depends whether, obviously, if you're a bigger family, you might just batch cook enough for 1 week for the whole family. But let's say it's just yourself and your partner, it might be that you can batch cook enough so that you've got kind of 2 or even 3 weeks worth to be able to kind of keep in the freezer and then just get out. So you batch cook once, as it were, and then don't have to do that again for another maybe 2 weeks at least. So that's another great kind of, if you've got the time to batch cook, which, as I say, probably requires 2 to 3 hours worth of your time once a week, or once, as I say, a fortnight, maybe even 3 weeks, depending on how much you cook all in one go. But then obviously, if you know that you are either super tight on time during the week, those meals are just like ready meals, but they're home cooked meals without any additives, any extra kind of bits in that you don't necessarily want in those meals. If you're trying to keep it low calorie density, for example, you can choose what goes into them. And then it's just like having a freezer meal, and you just get it out of the freezer into the microwave, and it's a super quick meal for you. So that's a bit of a difference between kind of just general prepping some food that's going to help you a little bit during the week, so you've got some bits prepared and it's going to save you a bit of time, versus literally cooking all the meals, the main meals that might be, quite time consuming, or those things which are actually just going to keep you on track with healthy eating. You might have lots of time to cook fresh lots of the time, but actually, sometimes you still might decide to have something convenient at that moment in time. But if you've actually prepared stuff and you've kind of maybe got it out of the freezer that morning, it's there ready for you to have, you're much more likely to make that healthier choice. So again, it just depends on the type of person you are and what works for you in your lifestyle, really, when it comes to batch cooking. Other things, apart from obviously those that I've just mentioned, or in terms of the benefits of doing something like this, obviously I've said for me personally, you know, I'm a busy mum with 2 children, I was running around with work and things as well. It does save me time in the long run. You know, as I say, when I've got the time, I really do prefer to batch cook as much as possible, because on busy weekdays where I literally have half an hour to spare, I can get something out of the freezer and just put it straight in the microwave, and it's a, you know, it's a lovely home cooked meal, ready to go in with very little effort. And whilst it's warming up in the microwave, I can be doing all the other things I need to do, like unpacking swimming bags and refilling school bags and making packed lunches and all those kinds of things. So it's great in that way as well. In general, when you do batch cook, if you're doing it all in one go, for example, even if you portioning it off and doing a couple of different little batches in a week, you can really reduce your energy bills as well, because obviously you're only using your oven kind of once, you're using the residual heat sometimes, and you're cooking more than one parts of a meal all in one go. So that's really handy. As I mentioned earlier, it does help a lot of people to stick to healthy eating choices in general, because if you know you've prepped it, it feels like convenience food because it's super quick and it's there ready. Then you don't use that excuse as much as, oh, I just need something quick, or I just haven't got time to make this. You know, that you take that element away from your decision making. It can save money, because if you have planned out what you're eating during the week, so you've decided on your main meals, and you've thought a bit about, you know, breakfasts and lunches as well, you can literally just buy what you need, rather than what quite a lot of people I do tend to find, you know, do. If they don't plan out what they're having for their meals during the week, they will just kind of get home and they'll think, oh, we'll just have that, and we grab that, and we grab that, and there'll be plenty of other little bits of food that often get wasted because you haven't necessarily planned how you're going to use it in a meal. So there often might be salady bits left over, or other, you know, fruit or veg that go off, because you haven't thought about what that's going into, and, you know, or sometimes just lack, you know, the knowledge or the creativity to think about what it could go into. You end up leaving it, and then eventually have to throw it away. So sometimes you can kind of save money and save waste on that as well. And I do find it does make my shopping decisions easier. If I've actually planned out, I've got a set shopping list, I don't go kind of and buy things, as I say, that I don't end up using, so I don't waste money in that side, on that side of things. But also it just makes my decisions about when I go to the shop, I know exactly what I'm going to get. I get those things. I don't get waylaid. I don't look at other things on the shelf and think, oh, actually, oh, I could get that, or I might get that. And, you know, you end up getting extra things, as I say, that perhaps you wouldn't have. And even those, again, convenient choices, or those less healthy options that you think, oh, I'll just get that. Whereas actually, if you're really focused and you've got your shopping list, you're like, that, you know, I even avoid whole aisles sometimes, going down whole aisles, because I've got my set shopping list, so I don't go down those aisles, which kind of drag me in thinking, oh, there might be something down here that I need. As actually, you know, I've got my, you know, I know where everything is, and then I do sometimes kind of avoid those as well, which is, you know, even myself, you know, I know what I'm talking about, but, you know, the temptation is always there. And I'm not saying you can't have treats and you don't want some of those things sometimes from those aisles, but, you know, sometimes it is, you know, nice to be able to just walk past them and think, oh, I'm not even going down that aisle today. Okay, so let's get back to thinking about energy levels then. Okay, so obviously one of the, you know, things is a do rather than a don't, is to focus on getting as many whole foods into your diet as possible. Now I'm going to go through what I mean by that in a moment. It might seem obvious to some people, but it's not always as obvious as some people think. One of the, you know, some of the main reasons why I suggest that people focus on whole foods for better energy levels is, A, it will help you stay fuller for longer. The more whole foods you get into your diet, they're actually really filling, because they are not processed, and your body is going to actually have to process those foods and break them down more. They end up staying in your stomach for that much longer to go through part of that digestive process, and so again, it gives you that feeling of satiety, feeling fuller in your actual stomach before you have that gastric emptying, which happens much quicker with processed foods. Obviously with whole foods, I mentioned it a little bit already, it limits things like all of the extra additives that are put into foods, not only for flavour, so all your classics like your sugar and salt and MSG and things like that, but also things like preservatives, which we do need in those foods, obviously, to make the shelf life longer. But ideally, when you can cook fresh with whole food yourself and you're making up meals with whole foods, you don't need to add those additives yourself, and you don't need to put the preservatives on, because even if you are batch cooking and you're making something, you don't need to put a preservative necessarily in there to keep that kind of fresh. You can just put it straight into the freezer and that's going to be fine, as long as you know that you're going to be consuming that within the next few weeks. It's really not going to be a problem whatsoever. So you can avoid putting those extra things in. And lots of those additives, even if they're really small amounts, you know, they are things which are going to increase your cravings. So just that little bit of extra sweetness, or even sometimes the extra palatability of anything that is more savoury, salty, has that umami type flavour, which gives it that kind of flavour that you're looking for in a food. You know, that will increase cravings because it's going to give you lots more little sugar glucose spikes. Okay, and I'll come back to kind of glucose spikes a little bit later. Now, there's nothing wrong with glucose spikes because we are going to get them every time we eat food. Anytime we eat kind of carbohydrates, you know, they've got natural sugars in, we're going to get some form of an increase in our glucose load. But what we don't want is we don't want it to be literally spiking too much all the time, okay? And I'm going to come back to that in more detail shortly. What we do want instead is we want a lot more slow release energy from the food that we are consuming, because that is going to make us feel better in general. It's going to keep everything on an even keel a lot more. So rather than thinking, oh, I need really something high energy, it's going to make me feel really good, and then having that what I call kind of sometimes, particularly when you're thinking about lunch or even evening as well, that like afternoon or evening slump where you suddenly feel quite lethargic after having quite a big meal. The more whole foods that contains, so the less processed foods, the better you're going to feel, because that energy, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be released so much more slowly and evenly from those whole foods compared to something that's processed and gets digested a lot quicker, and that energy is going into your system a lot quicker. It's much better to think about trying to eat foods that give what I describe as the kind of drip effect through your gastric emptying system. So, you know, you want it to be staying in your stomach for longer, and for it to be processed over a longer period of time, so that you get this drip effect of that kind of food, those nutrients going through into your small intestine and getting released into your body for wherever it is needed. Obviously, a lot of that energy is going into muscles as well. So you want to be thinking about some other things that you can do to how you might use that energy as well, which again will come back when it comes to lifestyle choices a bit later on in the session, and how you can get kind of things like exercise, for example, to interact with the types of food you're eating, when you're eating it, how much you're consuming. So one thing I want you to be aware of before I talk more about the difference between kind of whole foods and some of those other processed foods is to look a bit at kind of some processed foods and knowing what the difference is, particularly when we're talking about looking and trying to decide what to choose in the supermarket. Now, it's probably going to be fairly obvious some of these kinds of foods, and that, you know, yes, they're going to kind of give you lots of energy, but they're probably not that great for you. But there are some foods which can be really confusing. So it's, again, knowing a bit more about how food is processed, how it's labelled, how it's marketed, what you think about food based on these things as well, and your perception of different types of foods. So it might be quite obvious to you things like energy drinks, of which there are hundreds of now on the market, and energy bars, for example, whether it's protein bars, things which are supposed to give you a nice little boost of energy to keep you going. There's obviously all different kinds within those ones as well. So particularly when we're thinking about energy bars, You can have your protein bars, and there are different types of protein bars. So there's ones which will appear more healthy, ones which obviously, you know, perhaps aren't as healthy. They're still covered in chocolate. They've got loads and loads of other ingredients in, which are highly processed. But a lot of the time, you know, even those which are touted as perhaps, you know, healthier for you, they might say contain only natural whole food ingredients, you know, no additives, no extra sugar, you know, nothing else added in. You want to really be aware of marketing in terms of not just looking and accepting things like high in fiber, for example, as being something that's really beneficial, or added B vitamins, for example, particularly on cereals. It's thinking about, why does it say that, or why does it have to say that, and have I actually looked at the ingredients on the back to check what's actually in it? Because unfortunately with marketing, companies can get away with a lot when it comes to what they can put on their packaging. Now, even when that is cracked down on by government legislation, there's still lots that kind of can be added onto things to make it seem like it is particularly healthy for you. And we actually call this lean washing. So lean washing is basically where they might put things onto packaging that will make you think that it is particularly healthy. As I said, some of those things that I mentioned already, it might say high in fiber, added vitamins, added iron, all these kinds of things. But actually, it's still quite low in some of those things. So what it is it's comparing perhaps like for like to another cereal, or to a set number, which they say, well, you've got to be, you can only say it's high in fiber if it is over a certain amount of grams of fiber in that particular food, for example. Doesn't mean it's technically very high in fiber when we compare it to a whole food, like a fruit or a vegetable or a whole grain or a bean of some kind, for example. You know, those things are much higher in fiber and would be much better for you because they're not processed. They haven't had anything perhaps taken away from them like some of these other things. So even something that like that healthier looking perhaps cereal, there might be wheat flakes, something along those lines, that looks pretty healthy, actually is still pretty highly processed. You know, it doesn't represent the whole food that it started off as, which was a piece of wheat. Okay, so it is totally different. It's had its husk taken away, which has a lot of the original nutrition in it. It has been flattened. It probably still has had a couple of ingredients added to it. It's had a heck of a lot taken away from it, including a lot of the original fiber that was there. And what you will find is, even with things like cereals, although it might say, you know, added vitamins, added minerals, that kind of thing, what they've done is they've obviously added that in afterwards synthetically. It was in there originally. All your B vitamins would have been in that original wheat, and it would have had extra additional nutrition, as I say, as well as the extra fiber, which is now missing. And so they've actually had to add that in synthetically, which doesn't always behave in the same way in terms of absorption and in terms of its interaction with other vitamins and minerals. Whereas when it was the whole grain in the first place, when you consume that, it naturally had everything packaged the way that would be best, essentially, in terms of our nutritional needs. So it's nothing to say that there's something wrong with those cereals, but there are always better whole food options, you know, and that is across the board for lots of these processed items. So what I want you to get into thinking about is, you know, is there a better whole food or less processed option compared to what I'm about to consume or choose in the supermarket? And could I use that instead? There's nothing wrong with consuming some of these things, so energy bars, energy drinks, and things like that, in terms of, you know, people will say, oh, well, you know, it's really good good for my energy at the time. If you're about to take an energy drink or have an energy bar and go for a run, go and lift lots of heavy weights in the gym, go and do something extremely active, and you're using your muscles straight away, and you're using that glucose essentially that goes in and gets stored in your muscles as glycogen, and you're using that straight away, then yeah, you're probably not going to feel the effects as much as what lots of people actually do when they think, oh, I'm feeling really lethargic now, I need to take that energy drink so that it just gets me through the afternoon, but they're sat at a desk all afternoon. What they're not then doing is actually using those muscles and using that, so they're still going to get an energy spike for a short period of time, and then they're going to feel really, really lethargic again not too long after that, because they've not actually used that glucose is going to be going around their system, because if their muscles are already full of glycogen, there's only so much they can take, and they are, they're not going to be using that energy up. So therefore what it's going to do is actually, the effect of that is going to make you feel quite tired later on. So it's actually going to be detrimental for those people who use these high energy foods and then don't actually go and expend any energy in the next 2 to 3 hours after that. So think about it in that way. And there's, as I say, there's nothing wrong with those things, and people do use them for high energy. And particularly, I work with lots of athletes, and I wouldn't always necessarily want them to choose the most kind of highly processed energy drinks. There are various options, as I say, within that remit, and same for things like energy bars. And I'd always want to give them the healthiest option possible, but there is a time and a place for that kind of necessary immediate energy. But essentially, things like just a glass of orange juice is going to give you the same impact as one of those energy drinks, and it is going to be healthier for you. But again, orange juice, in the case of your everyday person who's just going to go and sit down and not use all of that glucose that then goes into their system, isn't going to be the healthiest choice. The healthiest choice would be to have the orange. So it really depends on who you are, your lifestyle, and what kind of activities you're doing. So thinking about energy in terms of high energy dense foods, and then whether you're actually going to go out and do some activity after consuming that. But also then, if not, what other whole food options could I choose that are going to be much better in terms of giving me a much more even drip effect of that energy going into my body. Also, just very briefly to be aware of, obviously we've got traffic light labelling as well as kind of all those other marketing ploys as such on the front of packaging. Yes, they are a good indicator. They're a good kind of quick indicator of things, but please be really careful just relying on those as your indicator as to whether you think it is good for you or not. Just because it says it's kind of, you've got red on the salt or the sugars or the saturates or the fats, doesn't necessarily mean it is kind of a bad food to choose. The best indicator is always to turn your packaging around, look on the nutrition facts, which will be helpful somewhat, but particularly look at ingredients labels. I'm going to go through an example in just a second, because you really just want to see what is in that food, how many ingredients are in there, and what kind of nutrition it's actually providing for your body. Sometimes something that's higher in calorie can still be better for you in terms of energy levels and in terms of the actual nutrition that you're giving your body, compared to something that's quite a low calorie item but is highly processed and maybe has lots of other additives in, which aren't going to be particularly great in terms of how you feel. So just before I move on to looking at those ingredients, just when, again, you're comparing like for like, so let's say you've got two particular items, it's the same kind of food, but you're not sure which one is going to be best for you. When you're looking at those nutrition facts on the back, or even if you're looking at those traffic lights, don't forget you must compare always by 100 grams or 100 ml rather than the portion size is always better. So if you've got two items, compare by the 100 grams or the 100 ml to give it much more like for like, because what you will find is obviously serving sizes, even with the same type of ingredient, a type of food that you're looking at, will sometimes give different serving sizes as well, and so it can be a little bit confusing. So just make sure you're really kind of clear on those as well. But in terms of actual looking at ingredients and trying to make it as whole food as possible, even though these are processed items, so we're just looking at some kind of versions of a tomato passata here that we might use with a pasta dish or in some sort of I don't know, it could be anything with kind of a nice Mediterranean veg type dish where you're kind of got your tomato sauce in there as well. Even with these, when you're comparing this, looking at an ingredients list rather than some of those other labels that we just looked at, are really the best way for you to make a decision on some of these. So having a look firstly at your bog standard tomato passata, ideally, I would buy this kind of thing the majority of the time. It just contains tomatoes on the ingredients list. The first thing, again, don't forget on ingredients list, the first things in there are the things which are the biggest percentage, of course, of that particular food item that it's made up of. As you go down the list, there is a smaller percentage of each of those other ingredients. So we want to pay attention particularly to those kind of top ingredients on that list. So with my basic tomato passata, tomatoes, and then it's just got basically citric acid, which is an acidity regulator, like a preservative. That's all it has got in it. That's what I'm looking for as much as possible. I don't want lots of additives and things in there too much. Now, the next one, you think Tesco Finest, perhaps might be an upgrade. Again, we've got tomatoes, ideal as the first ingredient. That's what we want to see. Tomato puree, some olive oil. Again, nothing wrong with this. Garlic puree, sun-dried tomato, basil. We've obviously got the sugar. We've got the salt added into this one as well. And then lactic acid, again, another acidity regulator, which I'm not too worried about. I'm not too worried about the majority of that. Obviously, I'd quite like it if I made my own, or I just bought the basic one and I didn't have that extra little bit of sugar and salt if I don't need it in my diet. But if you don't have too much of it and you're not eating it too regularly, it's nothing to necessarily worry about. One thing that I am sometimes concerned over, and it's not the actual ingredient itself, but it is things like the olive oil, which is obviously only third on the list, which means it's a relatively high percentage compared to some of those other ones underneath. And it is a high calorie density food. So if you do eat a lot of this, or you go through it a lot, and you add oil to other foods, you may want to consider something that doesn't necessarily contain that if you're trying to reduce the amount of energy as such that you are consuming through your foods, because olive oil per kind of per any weight really is the most calorie dense food that you consume. Nothing wrong with having small amounts of it. It's just it does all add up, and it's for very small amounts. So it's certainly worth bearing in mind how much you're adding to your meals. Now, we then look at the dolmio, an absolute kind of family favourite, classic, trusted, very kind of knowledgeable family company brand that everyone would think is a great option. Now, we have a little bit of a different story on the dolmio. We've got tomatoes, great. Tomato paste, great. Sugar, third ingredient in there. So we've got a lot more of a sugar content in the dolmio compared to the other two. We then have other processed items. We've got modified maize starch, which are essentially comes from a carbohydrate and is just a kind of another almost version of a sugar. Obviously, it's not called sugar. It is just a slightly different compound, if you like, compared to the quick sugar, which we know as something like table sugar. We also then have salt added in there as the fifth ingredient. We've got some more oil in there, and then we've got our other things, which obviously much lower down on the list, which I would want more of if I was actually giving something a really nice flavour. I'd want the garlic to be higher up, the herbs to be higher up, even the onion powder and the spices to be higher up on that list. Obviously, I know not everybody has the time to make their own things like tomato passata, but what you can do is you can buy the basic tomato passata, which is, as you can see, just tomatoes, and then if you've got herbs, spices, garlic at home that you can just throw into that sauce as you're making whatever dish you're using it for, that's going to be a much better option. And again, when we're coming back to talking about energy levels, that is going to, more kind of, say, whole food things we can use. Yes, these are still processed because it's not just like eating a tomato, which is still going to be your best option, but it doesn't work well as a sauce. But, you can add other extra whole things in. You could add more veg into that as well. As I say, the herbs and the spices are great to add in, whether it's dried or whether it is fresh as well. So you can add in more whole food options to bulk that out and to give it the additional flavour. So that's just a little bit on how to assess ingredients lists, to pick out things which are less processed. And what you tend to find, like you can see with the dolmio, is that the longer that ingredients list, the more processed it tends to be, and the more highly processed items, extra ingredients that it tends to contain. So you want to try and avoid that as often as possible. As I said, with other things, a bit like with the energy drinks, there's nothing wrong really with the dolmio, but if you're thinking about trying to even out your energy levels a little bit, trying to kind of cut down on some of those highly processed items is going to help somewhat. And we'll talk more, as I say, about glucose, which will give you a bit more of an idea as well. Now, before I talk about glucose and how it affects your energy levels even more than that, I want you to understand the ingredients that we've been talking about a little bit more. Now, this is one of the infographics that I make for a lot of my clients so that they can kind of really understand and have a bit of a visual on how to categorize how you think about the foods that you're putting on your plate and that you're buying from the supermarket. So we're going to think about the difference between whole foods, which I keep talking about, minimally processed foods, and then the highly processed foods that we've been mentioning a little bit of, like in the energy drinks and things like that. We're going to have a look at why that matters in particular, what impact it's going to have on your body. How can obviously you tell how processed the item is? Well, we just kind of talked about that a little bit in terms of looking at the ingredients list and looking at those long lists, knowing that probably they are more processed than the ones with shorter lists. The fact that obviously all processed items aren't necessarily bad, they all kind of play their part, and they're, you know, you still have a place in your diet. And then obviously what they do to your energy levels. So first of all, that top category, whole foods, they're categorized as foods which really haven't changed from their original states. So, you know, you can look in there, you've got fruits, vegetables, whole grains, herbs, spices, meat, fish, nuts, seeds, that kind of thing. So really haven't changed very much from where they have come from originally. You want to try to keep your energy levels as even as possible. So we have that drip effect that we talked about already. You want to try and make up your meals, your plates, every meal time, and even obviously your snack options, which we'll come back to talking about as well, whole foods as much as possible. So you really want to just be being very mindful of how much of my plate is whole foods. Then you want to be thinking, okay, well, how much is actually minimally processed foods? Now, within the minimally processed food category, there's a bit of a ladder. And I'll give you an example in terms of the bread. So we've got the bread there. Now, we can obviously have all different types of bread. We know that we could have white bread. White bread is the most kind of highly formed processed form of bread. It has not only had the grain that has been broken down and taken the that center part of the grain out, which makes up the flour that we use to make the bread, but they've got rid of all of the husks, that outer bit, which actually has the most amount of nutrition and fiber actually in it. So when we were talking earlier about cereals having lots of the B vitamins in, you know, that's where you're going to find a lot of the kind of really nutritious part of that food. But in a white bread, obviously, we discard of all of that. We use the center part of the flour, which is essentially just the high carb load. It's kind of processed. It's high kind of sugar load, goes quicker into your system, and tend to, in white breads, have extra additives. They often add perhaps a little bit of extra sugar, salt, obviously preservatives, things like that as well. So you will find generally in white bread extra ingredients. So not only have you taken some of the good stuff away, but you kind of put some stuff in that perhaps we wouldn't necessarily choose to have in a food. With the wholemeal breads, obviously that husk hasn't been taken away. It's been kept as part of what goes into that bread, which is why it kind of is that colour, and you get more fibre in those because you've got that part of it still in that food. So again, increased fibre, increased vitamins and minerals. It's still processed because we still had to break things down and make it into a bread. But with the whole grain ones, we tend to have less additives in there. And you know, they do generally tend to be slightly healthier, and they will take your body that bit longer to break down. Anything with extra added whole seeds and things like that, or even some kind of nuts in. Sometimes you get things like walnut bread and things like that. Anything with extra fiber, things that your body's going to have to break down as you're consuming it, the better. As I said, sometimes these foods might be slightly higher calories, so you might have a seeded bread, a slice of bread, which is going to be higher in calories, or even things like rye bread, which are really much more dense and really high in fiber. They're going to be higher in calories than your slice of white bread. But what I don't want people to focus, even if one of your focuses is trying to lose weight, just focusing on every single bit of food being the lowest calorie possible food that you can consume. Because even if it's slightly higher calorie, what you will find is that it's still going to satiate you more having something that's higher in fiber that stays in your stomach for longer, because your body's going to have to break it down. So you'll actually be more satisfied and feel a bit fuller eating foods that contain that kind of thing. But also, the harder it is for your body to break down a food, the more energy you end up expending. So therefore, sometimes, and it's still minimal, but we eat every day, 3 times a day. So these small, little, tiny amounts do add up over time. So if we are consuming something that is harder for our body to digest, it has to work harder. Something that we kind of describe as the thermic effect of food as well. So, we're having to use more energy to break it down. We're going to burn a few more calories just consuming that food in the first place. And as I say, spends longer time in your tummy, so therefore hopefully you're going to feel a bit fuller from eating that, along with some other whole foods that you might consume with it. So that's kind of an example of how different foods can be within that minimally processed category. So again, when you're thinking about foods that come under that category, you've got things like your pastas in there as well. You've got things like nut butters. So, nut butters are, there's a real variety within those. You can get those now that are just 100% peanuts or cashew nuts or whatever it might be, versus those which are probably still cheaper to buy, sadly, but they will have the added sugar, the added salt, maybe some other extra preservatives, palm oil added in, things like that. So again, you have got that ladder within that minimally processed category. So if you're going to buy something from that category, try to go for the one that has been least processed or has had the least amount taken away and the least amount of extras added in. And then we have the highly processed category, which, as you can see, is all your classic kind of junk foods, treats, things that we all still like to consume. I still like to eat these things. But what I'm very aware of is that, obviously, they've had most of the nutrition taken away from them. I'm not going to be benefiting nutrition-wise from eating these foods. They're certainly going to be very devoid in things like fiber and plenty of vitamins and minerals and antioxidants. It's all been stripped right back, and you're left with all the high, calorie dense parts of that food, even if it seems like a low calorie food. So you can still get low calorie, very highly processed items. I'm still very aware of, I'm not obviously getting any nutrition, is not providing my body with anything apart from actual energy. And as you know, obviously going through this presentation so far, those kinds of foods, although they will give us a high amount of energy sometimes, that high amount of energy is going to be relatively short lasting, and it's going to give us that kind of spike that we don't necessarily want, because it's going to then make us feel quite lethargic later on. We perhaps didn't need that much energy. I'm not saying again that I don't consume these foods, because I do, but one of the things I think about, which I'm going to talk to you more about in a moment, is actually when I might consume these. So when we talked about kind of those whole foods, spending more time in your stomach because you've got to digest them, it's almost like if we consume some of those whole foods first, it's a bit like kind of plugging the gap. Just imagine there's like a little plug at the bottom of your stomach, okay, and you're kind of clogging that gap a little bit with some of those whole foods in a meal that you might eat first. So some of these highly processed foods, ideally you don't want to eat as snacks, because you've not got that going on in your stomach already, if it's almost like on an empty stomach a couple of hours at least after the last meal that you had, and that's going to be digested extremely quickly. It's already highly processed, machine has done it for you. It gives your body very little job to do in terms of processing, so therefore the gastric emptying on those kinds of foods is rather quick, and it goes into your small intestine, and all of that sugar breakdown that happens from whatever type of food it is, and the fat breakdown that you get from those foods is going to be going into your system a lot quicker. So you're not going to have that drip effect of the slow release energy that we need as much as possible, and it's going to be very quick into your system. So the best way to consume some of these foods to improve your energy levels is to actually consume them like you would having a pudding after a meal. Okay, so having something like that, a treat or a little item, highly processed item after a meal which has hopefully contained plenty of whole foods that are still there in your stomach being digested, and that you're not choosing these kinds of food as an intermediate or a snack type of food where you haven't already got that going on in your stomach. So, you know, when I do consume this kind of thing, it would be after a main meal as much as possible. And I would try to stick with whole food snacks if I am going to snack between meals. It is just choosing your basics, you know, your fruits, your vegetables with a bit of hummus, maybe that kind of thing is going to be your best option. It doesn't have to be either of those things. There's plenty of other whole food options, as you can see in that top category, you know. And one of the things I like to really point out to people is not necessarily to think about choosing foods that are categorized as a snack, or has to be something that we would consume for a lunch or for a dinner or for a breakfast. You know, you can move away from convention as much as you like when it comes to eating whole food. You know, if you fancy having something totally different for breakfast or for a snack that is within that whole food category, then you know, that is, you know, perfectly fine, and you can kind of get into your new routines by choosing things which appeal but are within that category that's going to kind of help you in terms of your energy levels. So just a little bit more then to finish off, thinking about kind of glucose and trying to avoid those glucose spikes, to give you some examples and some top tips on that. So linked to what I just talked about in terms of trying to reduce how quickly some of this energy is going to be used and getting into your system, trying to give you that slow release energy as much as possible. One lovely phrase which I kind of use is putting some clothes on your carbs, on your carbohydrates before you consume them. So when we talk about carbohydrates, of course, I don't just mean those kind of processed options as well, so those things in that highly processed category. I still also mean, yes, your kind of breads, even if it's your whole grain breads and pastas and things like that, but still things like, you know, your potatoes and your high carb loading vegetables, for example. You know, particularly if they've got things on them or you've added things to them. So lots of people might cook something, I don't know, like adding maple syrup to it, you know, like roast parsnips in honey, that kind of thing, you know, as well. Thinking about what kind of thing is on your plate, and actually before you consume the carbohydrate portion of your meal, which does contain, even if it's natural and it's whole foods, it will contain most of the kind of sugars that you're going to be consuming within that meal. Try and have what we call kind of a fruit or a veggie starter, ideally a veggie starter. So start your meals, if you've got a meal where actually you could choose to eat some of the, you know, particularly the dark leafy greens or the broccoli or anything along those lines, which are some of the best kind of veg that you can consume, try and go for a veggie starter. Think almost like Mediterranean style eating. They might often start with a big salad or a tomato salad with a drizzle of even oil or balsamic vinegar on the top. Consuming kind of as much veg and fibre first is ideal, based on what I talked about on the previous couple of slides, obviously filling that stomach up with the high fibre foods that start to be processed. Then think about what else is on your plate in terms of your protein option and things that are perhaps higher fat content. So that could be your meat, fish, dairy products, and then obviously all of your kind of beans, legumes, that kind of thing, any soya-based products, eating those kind of next. Then maybe consuming more of your higher carb foods last, and obviously your processed, anything that is kind of a processed food on your plate, leaving that till later part of your food. Now, I know this can be very different. You're not going to necessarily eat all of your vegetables on your plate, then eat all your proteins or your fats, and then eat all of your carbohydrates. I mean, you can do, and that's absolutely fine, but we don't tend to eat in that way, and it's not always 100% enjoyable to eat in that way. And obviously there are also meals, let's say a curry, for example, or something that is all mixed in. It's like a one pot meal where you can't easily kind of separate foods that way. But just even doing small amounts of that as you start eating, always just having in your head, being mindful of veggies first, if you can, have a good few veg from whatever that meal is as much as possible. then maybe some of the protein, fats, then maybe some of the carbohydrates, and again go back to eating more of the veg, and try just to kind of consume a little bit more mindfully in terms of the order of the food. Because again, linked to what I talked to you about, you can see on those kind of graphs the examples of how we consume food and when we're consuming, or how we're consuming them. Obviously, you know, it's to do with processing. So the carrot example, eating the whole carrot, still going to give you a glucose spike from the natural sugars that are in that carrot, but it's going to be a lot less, and it's going to be over a more prolonged period of time, that drip effect. However, having the version of that is highly processed, which might be the carrot juice, where it's already been processed by machine for you, your body has very little to do, then you are going to be having a much quicker sugar spike that's going to kind of go up, and then as you can see, you're going to have that that down very quickly as well. So things like the pasta, do think about having a veggie starter with it sometimes. Again, think kind of Mediterranean eating is a great way to think about it, having your veggie starter and then having your pasta afterwards. Or if it is all mixed in, make sure you really bulk out that meal with veg. A lot of the time when we think pasta dishes, we will be consuming the majority of that meal as pasta. What I want you to think about is maybe switching your viewpoint on that and actually consuming more veg and making that meal, the bulk of it being veg and a lot less of it being the pasta. So just, there's no reason to eat less, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. All you need to do is switch the types of foods that you're consuming and bulking them out with, yes, perhaps lower calorie density, but really highly nutritious foods, and those are going to kind of reduce kind of the lack of energy that you're going to feel by consuming something that is perhaps more processed and contains a lot more processed carbohydrates. Okay, so other healthy lifestyle habits, just as a quick kind of finisher here, I did say that I kind of mentioned them and how they kind of go in with that nutrition really. Really think about other things which will impact not only your general health, but how it impacts what your food choices are. So sometimes when we are really low on energy, we are more likely to make poor choices when it comes to our food, because we feel like we need to choose something that's going to give us lots of energy. Now, obviously, with the knowledge, hopefully, that you've gained today on how to keep your energy levels a bit more on an even keel, this will help somewhat. But don't forget, things like sleep plays a massive part in improving both your general energy levels. You will feel much better just having more sleep, but also when you are less tired, you are more likely to make healthier, better choices when it comes to food, and that's obviously then going to have that impact on your energy levels in a different way, like the ones we've been discussing. Relaxation and reducing stress, having high cortisol levels through stress really again can impact our food choices and just how we feel energy wise all the time. If we feel we're always kind of like high on kind of stress hormones or even adrenaline because we're just always on the go and we're not relaxing, again, we tend to choose foods that are going to think that we're going to give us lots of energy, but as you've learned so far, are not necessarily going to be the case in the long term. Now, exercise can be a bit of a mediator for some of those foods. So obviously, when we are doing some form of exercise, whatever it might be, using our muscles, and obviously our muscles using that energy, that glucose that turns into what we call glycogen that gets stored in our muscles to provide us with the energy we need to be able to use them, then you're going to help things again keep a little bit more even. So if you've got excess glucose going around in your system, if you're using then your muscles within a couple of hours after a meal, once it's being digested, then you will obviously use the energy and kind of top up what you've consumed, and then not necessarily have so much of that spike and then that kind of feeling of lethargy. So even just having your lunch and then having time to go out for a 10-minute power walk or something afterwards before you go and sit back at your desk, that is going to provide you with some benefit, you know, as long as you're actually putting, you know, a little bit of effort, not just having a little meander kind of round the block, but actually, you know, using your muscles somewhat. Obviously, you know, if you do other forms of exercise, you can think about using that to help regulate blood sugar levels as well. So it can be anything that you're, you enjoy doing, of course. I always recommend you choose things that you enjoy doing, particularly if you find exercise difficult to get into a routine to do. But as someone who works within sport and absolutely loves strength training herself, and very much a big promoter of lifting weights as often as possible, that is a really, really great tip and way to get into doing that, so that you regulate your energy levels using your muscles as much as you possibly can. Obviously, be mindful of these changes if you're thinking of making some of the top tips that we've talked about today. Habits do take a good while to put in place. You have to be mindful of them for a very good at least 30 days before it actually becomes any sort of a habit. So you do just have to really focus on thinking about what those changes are, and just trying to really stick to them for at least that amount of time before it sticks. But do also set yourself some achievable goals. If you've got something in mind, or even if it's just one thing at a time, please do kind of put something in place, maybe write it on a post-it, leave it where you can see it every single day. If you actually want some more tips on that kind of thing and setting yourself goals at this time of year, I have done a recent kind of little podcast episode. You can go on to my YouTube channel, so it's the PRO.FORMANCE YouTube channel, and one of the ladies that I work with here at PRO.FORMANCE, we do a regular chat on various topics, and one of them more recently has been all about kind of how you kind of set goals and things, particularly at this time of year for health goals. So do check that out. And obviously don't forget to try new things, activities, foods, and have someone to help you if you need it, an accountability partner, someone who is interested in doing this as well. So not just someone, like a partner who you perhaps live with, who's just like, yeah, I'll help you, whatever. Sometimes it's important to choose someone who's also interested in similar things to you and has similar goals to you, so that actually you're both interested in chivvying each other along and helping each other and giving each other ideas and doing the research on maybe some new recipes or how you get some more of these whole foods into your diet. That's really important. So choose the right person who could actually be an accountability partner that's going to be of benefit to you. And then lastly, really, it is just kind of thinking about these things which I like to sometimes end my presentations with, and that is to remember these things. It is okay not to be perfect straight away. It is progress over perfection. Don't worry if you don't quite meet your own expectations with making changes within those 30 days, etc. And we still also learn from our mistakes and what works for us and what doesn't work for us. And do think about some of these changes as a lifestyle change. Lots of people will think about these top tips and want to apply them, particularly at this time of year, based on something that is going to be a short-term benefit, like you want to lose weight as a classic example, or even just kind of get into fitness or whatever it might be. Think about whatever you choose to do. Is this going to be sustainable? Am I going to change it for the rest of my life? Essentially, that is what you want to do. Okay, so it's thinking about, is it sustainable? Is it too big a goal? Is it too big a step? Can I break it down into something smaller? Again, we want quick results the majority of the time. I love the bottom one. Your body is not actually Amazon Prime. Okay, it's not going to be delivered on your doorstep tomorrow or the day after that. Better health and fitness will not be delivered overnight, unfortunately. It is a process, and so you kind of have to accept it's going to be a long-term process. But then once you do accept that, then actually you can enjoy the process a bit more, because you can be thinking about, okay, well, I'm going to choose one thing at a time that I'm going to be successful at, and that I'm going to think it's going to be something. It's not going to be necessarily easy to start with, but actually something I can see is sustainable in the long term, and I'm going to try and stick to that as much as possible, as something which I just change as part of my lifestyle. It just becomes me. It's what I do. Okay, so try and think about your goals and any changes you make in that way, rather than just, oh, this is going to help me reach a short-term goal. Okay, so I know I've kind of just gone over my hour, but I do have extra time. I'm very, very happy to stay on and answer any questions. Feel free to put anything in the chat, or if you want to come off mute and you want to kind of actually ask a question, I'm very happy to do that. But as you can see, my contact details are on the bottom. You can email me if you have a personal question, info@proformanceuk.com, or you can head to the website. I've got a contact form on there, or if you just want to find out bit more about my other nutrition services or health and fitness services, then obviously feel free to head on there, and you'll kind of find out more information about what I and a couple of my other team members offer here at the base in Histon and Impington. Is there anyone who wants to come on and ask a question at all? There's either no questions or you're not brave enough. Anything for the chat? Nothing from anybody? Okay, well, as I said, please do feel free to get in contact if you do have a separate question, or if you're interested in booking some one-to-one kind of consultations, if you've got specific things you'd like to talk to me about. It has been lovely presenting to you, and thank you for those of you who've come on live, and also thank you to those of you who are watching the recording. I hope you have a lovely rest of your evening, and it would be great to see some of you join me on Wednesday lunchtime, which is 12 p.m. on Wednesday, and that's all going to be about meal planning, batch cooking, and budgeting for our expensive shopping that we have to do these days. The cost of food, I know, is a big thing for some people, and I'll be doing lots of top tips. Those people are really interested, even if you're doing it, like I mentioned at the beginning, a really small amount of that in some form. Hopefully it will give you some really kind of top tips on things that you can use, whether it's actually how to do it, how to store it, what kind of things to cook, what